Thanks. Really great to be here in Lisbon and appreciate the opportunity to speak at the Funding the Commons talk. It's an honor because I actually really believe in what this movement is trying to awaken in this discussion, which is it's unique, it is powerful, it is disruptive in the crypto ecosystem, and I'm going to do my part to contribute some thoughts. Today, I want to talk to you about this notion of regenerative value because it's been animating a lot of discussions with people within my team, and we want to open up this discussion so that we can actually have a broader opportunity this week here in Lisbon to have people come and engage with us, specifically on the Crypto Econ Day next week. There's some tasks that we actually want to complete, and we want to design some ideas around regenerative value. So consider this really the opening conversation that we hope invites you to come on in. So let me begin. I'm certainly not the first person that's been on this stage today to talk about all the problems that we see with the internet today. I don't think anyone would be here if we felt like things were going well. There's no question at the moment that the internet has been overtaken by economic interest and corporate structures that are monopolies, they are illegal monopolies, and they are creating huge distortions in the current economic system. They are the most valuable companies in the world on the basis of an extractive business model that now pretty much any consumer knows firsthand what those problems are. The question is, if we're going to replace this current system, what might it look like? So I think the answer first begins with looking back in history and understanding exactly how we got to this point. And I think you've heard little peeks of this over the last couple of hours in talking about, let's say, things like Bell Labs. And I want to begin there because I think it's a fascinating example. On one hand, Bell Labs was indeed this incredible idea factory, and it's extraordinary how many great inventions came out of one single place. And there was a commitment by this massive corporation, AT&T, to go and form a structure that could think about long-term moonshot-like innovations, and then, as Juan's discussed, actually move those things into production and deliver them into market. So we can trace fundamental innovations on one side and results on the other that are, no question, they've made massive contributions. The question is, if you look at this chart, what was the actual accelerant to moving from the research to the market impact? And I'd argue that answer comes in 1956. That's when the US government stepped in through a series of very tortured negotiations that they had with AT&T to determine how they actually were going to break apart this monopoly that AT&T had on innovation. And what they did, which was really interesting, was that there was essentially a compromise. It didn't solve everything, but what the government understood was that they needed to find a way for AT&T to loosen up some of the things that really could drive more competition. And so they went to the heart of Bell Labs and they said, all your patents, every single thing that you guys have done here on the innovation spectrum, and they constituted a patent corpus that was unlike anything that we had seen in history, overnight, they forced the company to flood the market with a cheap way of licensing every single one of Bell Labs patents. Think about that. Think about every single trillion-dollar company that we have right now. That's the equivalent. And you'd go in there and have the government force them to take all of their fundamental innovation. Google's search algorithm, as an example, right? Or the AdSense algorithm, the recommendation algorithms on YouTube. You know, I can go on and on. That's what we're talking about here in terms of the impact, right? And so you had all these patents, these incredible patents that created things like, that ultimately became things like the solar cell and the transistor, the laser, et cetera. Those now became affordable for people to license. There was also another part, which is that the government forced AT&T to also stay out of certain types of spaces, which included, critically, AT&T couldn't get into computers. So what did that do? it basically leveled the playing field and allowed for these fundamental innovations to be taken up not by a mega corporation, but actually by thousands of other corporations that could think about creating new things like hardware. And so what you had, and this is such a cool chart, is that if you, I'll just step to the side here, okay. So if you look here, it starts right after 1956, and you can see that there's this dramatic amount of market expansion. And I'd argue it's because of the consent decree, and that goes and it drives the hardware era, right? So this whole point in which you have now massive market expansion, and then consolidation, and then commoditization. This is that cycle that you're gonna now see happen several times over the course of the 20th century, because what happened was, of course, is that the hardware era gave way to the software era, and so as things got, let's say, more powerful with things, large companies like Microsoft, the same thing started to happen. Massive monopolies were created, there was consolidation, and then there were interventions at each step. Interestingly, there was government intervention at each step. So IBM in the 70s was taken on by the FTC, and through a series of basically chilling lawsuits, they ended up forcing IBM to become a better corporate actor. Microsoft, of course, famously was also handed down judgments that forced it to significantly curtail its monopolistic activity. We forget this, but if you were a startup at the height of the internet era in the late 90s, if Microsoft decided to bet against you, they would go to VCs on Sand Hill Road and explicitly tell them that they were not allowed to invest in you. That's what that world was like. So government action was required. Google is now grew out of basically the leveling of that playing field, and now we're a repeat of history. Google is now, of course, being taken on by the government again for its monopolistic practices. So enter the crypto era. What is this future going to hold for us? Are we going to continue the same cycle over and over again and basically rely on government to step in and provide this massive innovation, leveling playing field that we need? Or could we think about the fundamentals of how cryptographic networks work as a path to breaking this cycle? So I'd like to think about why this might be possible, because we might be able to appreciate the fundamental transformative things that happened with the creation of the internet. And maybe if we can treasure those incredible positions that brave innovators took back then, we might appreciate actually how there is been some consistency about a view of a better world. And what's really missing is just us actually treasuring that and not being so naive to think that it is impossible. Because when I look at this image here, I get a vision actually of how difficult it was to conceive of something like the internet. Consider this. This is the quote-unquote personal computer of the day in the early 60s. And when you had innovators like Douglas Engelbart looking at machines like this, they had to think about a world in which that type of machine would be something that was easy to use, it could sit in anyone's home, and critically, it needed to be connected to other computers. This was the augmented intelligence framework that Engelbart put forward in '62, which was really what I think of as like the initial architecture document of what we know of today as the positive possibility here of the internet. And what it was a document that put forward two really clear ideas. One was that computing should be something that's personal, not industrial, not commercial, but something that's accessible to anybody. And secondly, that it was one that required a decentralized network of knowledge that connected essentially all those different computers. Think about that. In '62, they had to bet on this idea that that type of computing network was possible. Nothing about the hardware of the era, nothing about the software of the era even made it remotely feasible for that type of thing to happen. They had to work doggedly over the next 6 years to think about taking that framework and then starting to actually create the machines that would realize it. So from that, you get incredible inventions like the mouse, the screen. And if you go to the mother of all demos in '68, it in fact went and put all these things together and a whole list of other inventions and took the computing era through a giant leap forward to really posit this notion that we needed an online system of knowledge. That's what Engelbart called it. So Those are the table stakes. All the ideas that we're talking about right now, they are not new. They've been actually from the very beginning of the creation of personal computing, the notion of decentralization, the notion of personal liberty, the notion of a connected network, those are all founding principles. But Engelbart, although he architected them and put them forward and created the first products, he was not the one that actually brought them to market. What happened was, through a series of very selective hires, Engelbart's lab was dismantled, and ultimately the best and brightest went over to Xerox PARC. And that's the story that most of us know. At least that's when I got into computing. The story was Jobs goes over to Xerox PARC, sees the mouse, sees the personal computer, and then basically steals it. None of that is true, actually. Jobs had, by the time he stepped foot in Xerox PARC, he had actually purchased all of Xerox patents. And he was the one that then went and brought it forth to market. But the difference is that he was not committed towards the idea of creating this notion of a public good. He was there going and trying to create a corporation. And so when you look at all the incredible innovations that came out of Xerox PARC, it's kind of a miracle, actually, that many of these things remained open source and they ultimately became public goods. But I'd say to you that one of the things that's actually miraculous about it is that even though Jobs had sat there and basically held the keys to the future of the computing kingdom, in fact, when you think about it, like so many of these ideas were so transcendent that even he couldn't even control them, in spite of his attempt to. So what emerged is really that we had a very clear vision of code. What I mean by that is software code, which is one that helped us create this form of computing, and moral code, which is actually very clearly thought through about why you would want to decentralize. And that's how I like to think about the internet code. It basically, if you break it down, it's this idea that there are actual critical components of the internet that we need to follow these four principles. And again, they were there from the very beginning. The notion of decentralization, the neutrality of the network, interoperability, personal liberty. These are things that I know we talk about here as these totems of how we're trying to fight to create a better internet. But remember, this is actually how the internet was originally designed. So, how did that really manifest? Well, it went through this idea that decentralization was one in which you could create a certain form of intelligence, not one that was centralized, where you needed, let's say, a centralized node like AT&T to basically do all the switching and the connecting, but instead, it posited that if you put power at the edge of the network, and you allowed the data and the routing and structures to actually sit within the same block, essentially be autonomous, you could have incredible things happen with that network. It would ultimately be more resilient, and there was a way for it to survive all sorts of different attacks and to grow. So that's the notion, and it's pretty familiar. When you actually go back to Tim Berners-Lee's first node on the web, it took me actually a while on this one. It was like I was staring at this photograph and I was like, what is remarkable about this? Well, it's because it's a personal computer. This isn't a mainframe. It's not a dedicated server that was made just simply for the creation of an internet node. This is a Next computer that was sitting on Tim Berners-Lee's desk. And in fact, it had a sticker there that said, hey, don't turn this thing off. It's actually a server, right? Think about that. That's the first node on the internet. That's how audacious of a thought that would be, that this is how you would actually want to create this decentralized network of knowledge. Okay, so what happened? Basically, we had the principle of decentralization translated into an architecture of the network in which we said, look, push all of the intelligence to the edge and make the network neutral, or make it dumb. That's what it's often called. And this idea is that basically that all the intelligence, therefore, if it's at the edge, would therefore be held by all the users. So when we fought for things like SOPA, PIPA, as an example, it was this kind of existential idea of, oh my gosh, if the internet was somehow challenged and then there was power that was centralized into these gatekeepers like the networks, that it would destroy the end-to-end principle. And so when that battle for net neutrality was won, you might think, well, that's it, we're done, internet saved, let's all go home. But the truth was that there was something much more pernicious going on. The very actors that were fighting to save net neutrality, well, they actually had a different plan because they had a different business model. What they were seeking to do was to co-opt the original vision, the original spirit, the original philosophy of the internet in order not to preserve the internet, but instead to preserve their supremacy as platforms. So how did that happen? Well, I think the answer is you've got to go back to Xerox PARC, because one of the interesting things that spun out of there was not just a protocol, like let's say something like Ethernet, but a vision of how certain entrepreneurs were going to take these protocols and put them into practice. This is instructive. How many people here know what Metcalfe's law is? One person, but actually you all know what it is. It's this concept of network effects. And this is, if you were running as an entrepreneur in the last 20 years and you walked into a VC's office, you'd have to pitch them on this idea that any technology that you created would essentially leverage network effects. And the notion is that basically as the number of users of your application or your network grow over time, it can grow to such a tremendous degree of velocity that ultimately it could entrench users in the network. You would get basically this adoption, or it would be addictive. Take all these different types of kind of pretty terrible terms to describe success. And essentially what it would do is it would make the network so valuable that you would not be able to leave. So this has been applied writ large. I mean, I with great deference, this is, a chart that I often would show entrepreneurs when I was guiding them in, the mid-2000s. It was something that Reid Hoffman had put together. And, basically you'd say, okay, listen, my technology would basically follow this business model of creating network effects. Even Bitcoin, for instance, was originally positive, saying, well, it's going to grow because of the value, essentially, of the network, and therefore it's going to be entrenched. And we basically have never questioned the success of this because it created these multi-trillion-dollar companies. But if you go back to the origin of it, I find it actually pretty curious because, first of all, it's wrong. And I'm going to show you how it's wrong. But also, even Bob Metcalfe, if you think about it, he was wrong on many levels. Most of all, he was actually fighting against the possibility of an internet. He said it would never work, and he said that if it did, he would actually eat his words, which he actually ended up doing. He took that article and he put it into a blender, and then he drank it. So at least he was, honest about that. But let's unpack this. What was really wrong with Metcalfe's law? It basically posited that every single node within the network had the same value, right? Which economists immediately blew up because growth alone is not necessarily intrinsically right. It doesn't actually create value. And second of all, when you actually look at it, really what it was is that Ethernet, where Metcalfe's law came from, it was really just a sales tactic to be able to sell printers and these accessories, basically, like from a computer. And Bob didn't even think that much about it. It was an interim sales technique that he used, but it was anointed as this law by George Gilder. And when you read Gilder's book, where he talks about Metcalfe's law, or then you read his successor books, something else emerges that I think is actually quite disturbing. Gilder has a political project, not an economic project. He and Peter Thiel, one of his famous proteges, they believe that monopolies are a good thing. Straight up. This is the future that they want. They have absolutely no problem with this type of distortion in the market, and the only challenge to a monopoly is basically another company that can become a monopoly. Is that really the world that we want to live in? And when you think about this idea of trying to empower users with technology, with a network, and you think about the problems of platforms, you have to ask yourself, is there an alternative? Well, when you go back to the original principles of how the innovators were thinking about this, people like Stuart Brand is an example, who's often cited in this world, and he's a very special person. He painted a vision around this idea of a commons, and I think that ethos is something that very much animates people that are in this room. And I want to share with you a quote that I really like, is that he talks about the idea of cyberspace, and he posits that this notion of autonomy and self-reliance allows for resilience. I think we all understand that. But he says something else. He says, where generosity leads, prosperity follows. Maybe, just maybe, we need to go beyond network effects if we're going to be able to achieve that vision. So let me talk to you about how that might work. The traditional network effects, as a rehearsal again, we have this bootstrapping problem trying to get people to adopt the technology. So what we need to do is provide massive amount of incentives, mostly in the form of venture capital, to heavily subsidize the product. And then boom, people start adopting the product. Its utility goes up because the network becomes more and more valuable, and then you become a monopoly. Cryptographic tokens are supposed to present an alternative. So with Chris Dixon, who's put out this actually very decent analysis and thinking about open network design, he says, look, instead of actually having VCs fund everything, why don't we go and have cryptographic tokens be issued, and they can become the basis of the subsidy that's required to drive adoption, to drive network effects, and you're off. Interesting, because obviously they're decentralizing some of the wealth creation, some of the accumulation of value to the users. That's a cool idea. But is that really all that we need? I'd argue no. I want to go over a couple of ideas. One is that I still think that inherent in all of this, what really is driving the success of blockchain as a fundamental revolution is this notion of transparency. And I talk to people within the Filecoin ecosystem especially about this because this is very important. SPs are in a position to make a lot of money with their cryptographic tokens. And the idea that somehow we can just subsidize storage and just say, come, store all of your data for free, everything will be fine after that. Well, we've already heard that story before. I mean, how is that actually fundamentally different from, let's say, Facebook? Saying, oh, just do all this stuff for free. Don't worry, it'll be fine, right? So we need to be transparent actually about the wealth creation and the effects of the work. Secondly is that we need to think about collaboration. If we're gonna stop this cycle of consolidation, we need to think about how vertical integration can be avoided and that we continue to have long-term cooperation and regeneration. This is, I think, the most powerful idea, which is that as you accumulate value within the organization, I like to think about DAOs because I think they're very efficient structures, but even protocols, same thing. The idea is that you need to always keep higher-minded values. So participation as the fulcrum for adoption. That means voice. Product quality as a driver of retention. And the diversification, inclusion, right? That is really what's going to get you to have a resilient system. Powerful ideas, right? And what I think this is going to do is that if we can focus on those types of notions, we can actually do a fundamental reordering. What I think is incomplete about Dixon's thesis about crypto economics is that it still has this notion of value as basically being profit. And it has also this notion that growth is something that is actually the most important priority. I think that we're already starting to see that both of those things are probably not going to actually work for humanity. If we continue with those priorities, we're likely not going to be able to survive as a species. So GDP is one of those very interesting cases where now communities, countries, are starting to understand that actually if GDP is the only metric for your success, essentially the growth of GDP, we're not going to be able to sustain our way of living. So people are already starting to move off of that. There are incredible innovations that are going on in urban planning to think about how we can move away from growth and ditching even this notion of GDP altogether. To think about more holistic principles that are transparent, that are collaborative, that are regenerative. This is this idea of donut economics, which I really like, not for this talk today, but I urge you to all take a look at it. These are the types of templates that people are starting to use to drive things like urban development and also green technology. But what I invite you all to join me on Tuesday is to think about the next thing, which is that I don't like the notion that all these types of higher-minded ideals are simply the domain of things like impact. Or something else that, philanthropists will deal with, or other people. No, let's actually go to the heart of the corporate system right now and reimagine this notion of value. Where we go beyond revenue, we go beyond strict utility, and we get into this multiplier around valuation, and we think about how we can use, as an example, block rewards, which are an important part of this ecosystem, to drive things like utility, sure, but things like long-term sustainability, innovation. And what we need is to come out of this with actually brand new business models that look beyond growth and actually think holistically, like literally on your balance sheet, you would have a way of crediting a company for its notions of value that go well beyond profit. These would be assets in the company that would actually drive not intangible assets, but actually like core, clear, recognized accounting to say this company actually can survive. This company has an innovative business model that can drive inclusion, that can drive participation. And there's many ways to do that. And that actually is, I think, going to be the most important thing that comes out of this revolution with blockchain, is that you're going to get a brand new corporate form. So I'd love to continue the conversation on Tuesday, I think in depth, but I'm happy to take some questions here. This, to me, is the greatest surface area for our opportunity here. It's not just the commons that is outside of the corporate world, but actually bringing the commons into the corporate structure itself, and to think about how the next generation of corporations are going to have new priorities, new ways of sustaining themselves. And I can't wait to start on that. So thank you for joining me, and happy to take some questions.
Hi, thank you for that lovely talk. Yeah, really appreciated the history on Doug Engelbart, and just made me think of all the great stuff around there. I guess one of the things that is coming to mind is value, and the notion of value, and the difficulties around plural forms of value. Yeah, and basing them on some kind of non-contentious factual element. Yeah, I'm just wondering what thoughts you have around there.
Well, I think that let's look at kind of the building blocks of how that might work. The B Corporation created a way for us to just start to eliminate certain liabilities for officers if they started to think more holistically about value, right, and impact and stuff like that. So I think we're seeing, you know, trends that are heading in the right direction. But I actually think that our best friends in this discussion are accountants. Because until we actually go and we change the balance sheet, there is no way to actually get people to understand what a valuation might look like unless we can see that there are certain assets that are considered holistically in what type of value that they're contributing. This can be done. This is not impossible, and I think this is one of the, if I was to start with one thing, it would be that, because audacious, crazy things can actually happen with corporate forms. Even, you know, within most of people's lifetimes here, you know, the notion of the LLC, for instance, that took off. It was a fanciful idea in the late 70s. It took time in the mid 80s for people to finally understand, and then it took off, and it's the dominant corporate form in the United States. Why? It's because the IRS in the mid 80s finally decided how they were going to tax this thing. Right, so notions of essentially the accounting, the principles around taxation, and then what ultimately your balance sheet will look like, those to me are like actually where a lot of this innovation is going to be driven. And the good news is that crypto can do a lot of things in creating alternative marketplaces that can start to recognize that value and then, you know, be able to syndicate it, trade it, et cetera. So I think there's great opportunity there. Yep. Very cool. We'll have to follow up on it. So,
hi. Just to comment on that, actually connected to that. So there's a lot of work on the high level. How do we get this going side of things? Like there's a book called Prosperity by Colin Mayer that touches on a bunch of these points, including the need to lean on accounting principles and make sure that they reflect actual value generated, not just whatever the P&L currently says, because that's a losing proposition. But then there's, of course, does the market recognize the value side of it, right? And connected to that, myself and a bunch of other folks that are here that are working on natural regeneration. There's a lot of work that's happening on various forms of payments for ecosystem services, which is just one of many ways to kind of create more material and easy to account for forms of seeing these capital flows, right? And the point is really that these are self-fulfilling prophecies, right? They don't currently exist because there's no market that actually believes that companies will be built on top of this in the future, right? And it really boils down to where is the scarcity going to come from? Is it going to come from regulators saying you can't overfish, you can't overharvest, you can't overpollute? Or is it going to come from the market side, or a mixture of both?
Yeah, I mean, I hear what you're saying. The only thing is it's important to recognize, I think, how corporate incentives have already started to change pretty massively. I mean, at this point, being a good corporate citizen is not an option. You actually have to have some sort of commitment to higher-minded ideals in order for you to connect with your consumers. And that, I don't think there's a single member of the Fortune 500 who would say, oh, yeah, we don't care about that. That's someone else's problem. The problem is that if they do that really well, they might get brand lift from the whole thing, but where is that recognized on their balance sheet?
Exactly.
Right? And if I wanted to inorganically, let's say, acquire that type of company, I actually would be paying a premium on those types of things, but I have to build that into a valuation model that there's really no standards around, and more importantly, there's no visibility and there's no accountability around that type of thing.
There's no upside, right? It's all about brand risk management.
Right. Well, I mean, I'd argue there's significant upside. Like a company could be extremely valuable if it does these things well.
It's just
the point is that we're letting investment bankers drive that conversation, or bankers when they're extending loans for the viability of the company. I'm saying, first of all, let's let the consumers vote and prosper through that process of basically becoming stakeholders in that company. And then secondly, let's create the marketplaces that could establish the type of standards to think holistically about value, the transfer of value, the syndication, et cetera.
Yeah, just one addendum to that is that there's a problem with time horizon mismatch as well, which is quarterly balance sheets versus multi-year, multi-decade impact, and these two are kind of hard to reconcile. So that's yet another reason why the self-fulfilling prophecy cycle is kind of hard to change.
Sure, agreed. My offer to you, which I think is a very realistic proposition, is that if you give consumers, as an example, more power and more economic reward through their ownership of the companies that they use and they care about, amazing things are going to start to happen on that front.
Thanks.
All right, then I'll see you all on Tuesday. Thanks.